Today is February 21st, 2021, and today we're closing out our series on singleness and marriage by talking about Ezekiel chapter 16 and other closing thoughts I have. I originally planned to read this chapter to you guys, but it is quite long and it would take up most of our time. So I'm just going to give you a summary of kind of what the chapter is about. Basically, in the chapter, God gives this revelation to Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, about his people, the Israelites, his covenant people, who he's married to. Again, this, and Hosea talks about that. Jeremiah talks, all the prophets talk about this. It even goes back to Moses, this language of idolatry as adultery. They even sound similar, but idolatry as adultery. Obviously, that's in English, but still. So it's a theme just all over the Old Testament that God's people are married to him, and when we sin through idolatry, putting other gods before him, every other sin starts with that, we are committing adultery, spiritual adultery. You see, it's evident by many different Bible verses, and I have a list of all of them that I posted in a blog a while ago. Maybe I'll try to link that to this. But that sex on earth and in the flesh and physical, that act is a parable, or it parallels what worship is in the spirit, spiritually. So in the spirit realm, worship, loving something, what do I mean by worship? Loving something with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, that is the equivalent to sex, in the physical act of sex. And so when we worship something other than God, we are essentially, if we are in covenant with God, if we are Christians, if we are grafted into Israel, if we are Israel, we are cheating on God, betraying God, committing adultery against him who is our husband, and we his wife or bride. In Ezekiel chapter 16, it tells the whole story from beginning. In the beginning, God finds Israel, and it compares Israel to an abandoned baby, because in those days, they didn't have abortion back then, but if they couldn't afford the baby, or they didn't want the baby, they thought the baby was ugly or something, this was a thing. After the mother gave birth, or the midwives, they would see the baby and be like, oh yeah, we don't want it, or we can't have it for whatever reason. They would go put this newborn baby covered in blood, they wouldn't clean it, anything. They would go put it in a field and just leave it there to die or be eaten by animals. And this was a thing that happened back then. Brutal time, I know. But, so with that understanding, he describes, this is who you were. He says to Israel, your parents, they were from these other pagan nations that didn't care about me. But I was walking through the field and I saw you abandoned and alone, covered in blood, crying, a little baby. And I picked you up and I made you my own. I became your father. And then it talks about how he raises them. And then, this part might get a little weird for some people. It says, when she grows up, because Israel's compared to a woman in this, then she develops, she's fully grown, she's ready to be married, and then it basically says, and then I married you, and then we got married, and you became my wife, and then I loved you, and I gave you all this jewelry, and I gave you everything. I provided all these wonderful things for you, and this wonderful life, and houses and homes, and all this stuff. And then it says, and how did you respond? Well, you went and got all these other lovers who are not your husband, and you committed adultery with me again and again and again. And it describes that graphically, very, very graphically. Even translating in English is, I think, hard for people because it's like, oh, wow, we don't want the Bible to say certain words. There's like a lot of sexual terminology that's very graphic in Ezekiel chapter 16 to describe the type of adultery that Israel was doing spiritually to God. And so, it goes so far, like as it's getting toward the end of it, God's saying, he says, you were not like a prostitute, because a prostitute actually gets paid for what she, and I should mention here that when we talked about Hosea, Hosea was sent to the northern kingdom. Okay, so there was a civil war, there was a northern kingdom of Israel, and then a southern kingdom of Judah. Okay, so by this time, by the time of Ezekiel, the northern kingdom was destroyed, basically disbanded. All the people were lost among the other nations. There's 10 lost tribes of Israel. It's kind of a mystery. People talk about it because those people are not the Jews. We don't know who they are. Some think they're among the Muslims today. Some, there's a lot of discussion about this. But the point is that Ezekiel was sent to Judah, so the southern kingdom. So, and there's comparisons like where God says, you were like her. He calls it your sister, who was in the north, but you were worse to me because she was a prostitute, right? But but he says, you were normally a prostitute gets paid for having sex with all these other people. But he says, no, you paid them. You're like, please have sex with me. I'll pay you. And it's a woman in the analogy. This is in Ezekiel. And God's like, you're doing this to me. You're paying other people to have sex with you when you have a husband that you're neglecting. And it's so, when you read it, just the pain of it, that God has been betrayed and he's brokenhearted over this, over his people, Israel, betraying him again and again and again. And it describes the types of wild sex that they have under all these different trees. And it's a really crazy chapter. I'm not going to recommend this artist to you because I don't think I'm going to tell you there's a song called Ezekiel by Gungor, a band called Gungor, Gungor. It's called Ezekiel. Beautiful song, incredible song. It's literally about Ezekiel 16, and it describes in a very beautiful but painful way like what God is saying, and it has the emotion in it. It's by Gungor. Now, sadly, I can't recommend Gungor anymore. As a matter of fact, I don't think they even exist anymore. But the people Gungor do exist, but they got into some really weird beliefs and stuff that I definitely do not support. And unfortunately, for example, having a podcast where they're basically saying that Jesus was a sorcerer, or they had someone on there that was saying that and condoned it, and so. So anyway, but still, Ezekiel's a great song by Gungor. That's from 2011, back before they went in this weirdness. But so God says that, he said, you were paying other people to have sex with you. You've abandoned your husband. It says in verse 32, Ezekiel 16:32, you adulterous wife who receives strangers instead of her husband. To all prostitutes gifts are given, but you gave your gifts to all your lovers. You bribed them to come to you from every side in your harlotry. So you're the opposite of other women. No one runs after you for favors. You give payment, and none is given to you. So you are the opposite. So they're so desperate, and they're like nobody wants them. It gets to a point where they're just this used up. I don't want to say the S word because I feel like it's going to offend people, but you know what I'm saying. A word that starts with S that is talking about a loose woman, okay? So this is what Israel becomes, basically, and nobody wants them anymore, so they're bribing other people, but they don't want, my husband? The Lord? No. Horrible. So horrible. And this is what God went through, what God goes through with us when we sin and can continue sinning. And then he says, one last analogy I'll say is that he says, we had children together and you started killing our children. Like, this is not only a woman who's committing adultery against God, but she's killing the children. And this is, yes, it's an analogy, but this is a real, Ezekiel 16 is trying to get, God is reaching to people to realize this is how you make me feel. This is how you betray me. This is what you do, as though it were really happening and it was a real wife and a real husband. The real feelings of that in these situations, a wife killing her children that she had with a husband and going around to the point of where she's a woman that no other man wants, so she's paying other men to have sex with her. Oh man. So this is what Israel did to God. This is what we do to God when we sin, when we're his people. Again, this is talking about people who are married to God, in covenant with him. That's what covenant means. Covenant is marriage, or also commitment, in a committed relationship. God doesn't just go get in a committed covenant relationship with everyone. You see, he was originally in covenant with all of humanity, but then when Adam and Eve sinned, it wasn't that way anymore. Then we have our covenant and our marriage really to Satan at that point. But then, through time, God makes specific covenants with chosen people, and then it goes down to Israel, and then ultimately to Jesus, and everybody who chooses Jesus is grafted in. Talks about in Romans, I believe it's Romans 10, somewhere between 10 and 11, being grafted in to the people of Israel. So that's Ezekiel chapter 16. So I want you to think about this. The Bible spends a lot of time talking about how we're married to God, and that when we sin, that's what we're doing. It's spiritual adultery. Even the book of James talks about spiritual adultery. So God wants to have a romantic relationship with you. I'm just going to go ahead and say that. I believe that based on these things, And I'm going to say that because why would he spend so much time talking about this? And why would he say, I'll just put it to you literally, he says, love Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And if you are in a romantic relationship, especially one that consumes your life, where you're not able to love God with all these things because you're loving them with all these things, not only is it idolatry, but it's, you're worshiping that person. And so consider that. Now I'm trying to figure out how to segue to the last things I wanted to say from yesterday. We all have needs. We have emotional needs. We have, we even have sexual needs. I'm just going to say that, that can't really be fulfilled physically outside of marriage. God wants to be the one for everyone who fulfills all your needs. I believe that. I still question how, specifically, as a single man, I really do. I ask the Lord, how can you fulfill my sexual needs? I really don't see how you can do that. I don't. I feel like I'm SOL when it comes to that category. I just have to keep running from the temptation forever and ever, and what am I going to do? But God wants to fulfill our needs, every need, especially emotional needs. So I'll talk about that. I think the problem with the soulmate idea, and closing up what I've been talking about, is that people try to use other people, and it's not just men and women. This is Christians really don't talk enough about homosexuality and these other things, being gay, being bi. That they don't talk about it. And really, at the root of it is the same romantic thing that we've been talking about it this whole time. It's the same thing. It's worshiping other people, and people want to do this because they find meaning in this. And really, it's just you set yourself up to get hurt, because we weren't meant to have all of our emotional needs fulfilled by another person. Other people can't do that for each other. Only God can fulfill your emotional needs. Sexual needs, well then, I don't know. I'm still wrestling with that one, to be honest with you. So, I gotta close out. That's all I'm gonna say. I've talked enough about singleness and marriage. To married people, I say, is there any way in which you're trying to look to your spouse to fulfill certain needs that only God can fulfill for you? Actually, I'm gonna say that to single people too. But to single people, on top of that, let me ask you a challenging question and leave you with that. Why, if you want a relationship and you're single, and you're like, man, I just want someone in my life. I want to be married. If you're a Christian, I want to be married. Why do you want to be married? Why? Think about that. God bless you.